I've lived close enough to an HOA for long enough to learn one absolute truth. There's always that person. The one armed with a clipboard, a laminated badge, and a voice that somehow sounds annoyed and bored at the exact same time. And even with all that experience, I never imagined I'd wake up one Saturday morning and stumble into what can only be described as a discount, low-budget territorial standoff. Not over noise complaints. Not over a fence line. Not even over parking. No, this time, they blocked the entrance to my cabin. And the best part? They blocked it using my bridge. I wish that were an exaggeration. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't metaphorical. It was literal, physical, and honestly, pretty stupid. My cabin sits just past a quiet neighborhood, tucked beyond a stretch of trees and a winding road. Nothing fancy. I built it years ago as a place to disconnect, breathe, sip coffee slowly, and remind myself that silence still exists somewhere in the world. To reach it, you cross a small bridge, solid construction, reinforced steel underneath, old-school craftsmanship. I built that bridge decades ago, long before an HOA ever decided to slap its logo on a mailbox. That detail matters. A lot, but Karen didn't know that. And Karen, whose real name wasn't Karen, so let's call her Linda, had plans. That Saturday started out perfect. Cold air, clear skies. One of those mornings where the world feels cooperative for once. I tossed a bag into the truck, already picturing wind to the trees, maybe a fire later, and absolutely zero interaction with other humans. Then I rounded the bend toward the bridge and slammed on the brakes. Sitting dead center in the driveway was a barricade that looked like it had been assembled by a community theater prop department. Folding chairs, traffic cones, a bright red "No entry," sign zip-tied to a plastic sawhorse. And behind it, like an audition lineup for HOA, the musical, stood a row of women with crossed arms, identical expressions, and the unmistakable posture of people who have been waiting their entire lives for this exact moment. Leading the charge, of course, was her. Linda stood front and center, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a sacred text. Sunglasses on, smile tight, chin lifted just enough to project authority, without saying a word. I rolled my window down slowly, already feeling my blood pressure bargain with my sanity. She stepped forward instantly. "You can't drive through here." No good morning. No explanation. Just a statement delivered with the confidence of gravity. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice neutral, because experience had taught me that with people like this, tone matters more than the actual words. She gestured vaguely behind her, without even turning around. According to HOA rules, private vehicles are not permitted beyond this point without prior approval. Approval from her. I blinked once. Then again. "Linda," I said, because yes, I knew her name. "This is the road to my cabin." Her smile widened, not warmer, wider. The kind of smile that says I've been waiting to say this. That cabin falls within the community's regulated access area. I looked past her at the cones, the chairs, and the clearly home-laminated sign. "You're blocking my driveway." She tilted her head slightly. "We're enforcing policy." And there it was, that word "we." Behind her, the others nodded, some smug, some unsure. One woman clutched a thermos like she expected this to be a long event. I took a breath. Linda moved the barricade. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction. "You don't have the authority to tell us that." That's when I stepped out of the truck. I walked toward her slowly, calmly, boots crunching against the gravel. I wasn't angry yet, but I was fully aware that this situation had crossed a line from annoying into surreal. "You're standing on my land," I said. "You're blocking access to my property." She scoffed, actually scoffed. "That's not possible. This is a community road. The HOA controls access." I smiled, not because it was funny, but because I knew something she didn't. "Linda," I said, pointing behind her, "the bridge you're standing on, I built it. I maintain it. I hold the title." Silence. Not dramatic silence. Confused silence. Heads turned. Someone whispered, "What?" Linda laughed, sharp and quick. "That's ridiculous." "It's not," I said, "and you're trespassing." That word landed differently. Her expression shifted for just a second. Doubt crept in. Not enough to stop her, but enough to make her uncomfortable. "You're mistaken," she said louder now, as if volume could fix the problem. "This neighborhood has always used this bridge. That makes it community property." "No," I said, "that makes it used property, not owned." I could see the gears turning, grinding against disbelief and pride. Because if what I was saying was true, then everything she thought she controlled suddenly wasn't hers. Without that bridge, the neighborhood didn't connect to the main road. No bridge, no deliveries. No bridge, no commuters. No bridge, no emergency access. And just like that, this stopped being about my cabin. It became about the uncomfortable reality that the Queen didn't own the castle gate. I stepped back, crossed my arms, and said evenly, "I suggest you clear the driveway." She opened her mouth to argue again, and that's where things started getting interesting. Now pause the story for a moment, because this is where most people believe HOAs have unlimited authority. That misunderstanding is exactly what people like Linda depend on. By standard procedure, an HOA only has power over what it legally owns or what homeowners have contractually agreed to give them control over. That usually means clearly listed common areas, shared lawns, pools, clubhouses, sometimes private roads if they're deeded to the association. What it does not mean is, we've always used it, so now it's ours. That's not how ownership works. Private property doesn't magically become HOA controlled just because it's convenient. Bridges, easements, access roads, those are very specific under property law. If someone built it, maintains it, pays taxes on it, and holds a deed, then the HOA's authority stops right there. Full stop. Now let's talk psychology, because this is where Linda truly miscalculated. This is a classic trap in small-scale power structures. People who gain authority in low-stakes environments like HOAs often begin confusing administrative power with real power. They enforce rules long enough without resistance that they stop checking where their authority actually ends. Pushback feels like disrespect, not disagreement. And that mistake was about to cost her. Blocking the road was never about safety or policy. It was about dominance, performed publicly with witnesses, folding chairs, cones, and signs. It was theater, the kind designed to make compliance feel unavoidable. But here's the flaw in that strategy. The moment legal ownership enters a conversation, intimidation collapses. As soon as documentation replaces opinion, the entire game shifts. And Linda walked straight into that shift without realizing it. She stood there a beat longer than she should have. That pause mattered. You could almost hear the calculations run behind her sunglasses. Authority versus uncertainty, pride versus risk. And for someone like Linda, backing down wasn't merely inconvenient. It was humiliating. She squared her shoulders and tapped her clipboard like it was a gavel. "This is ridiculous," she said, loud enough for her assembled audience. "You can't just claim ownership because you feel like it. The HOA has operated this access point for years. That gives us jurisdiction." There was again that word jurisdiction. People like Linda love words that sound official, especially when they don't fully understand them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I looked at her, then at the chairs, the cones, the sign, and then back at her again. "Move the barricade," I said. Calm, flat, almost bored. Her jaw tightened. No. That single word shifted the moment from absurd to serious. One of the women behind her shifted awkwardly. Another murmured, "Maybe we should call the board." Linda ignored them. She was committed now. You don't haul folding chairs out on a Saturday morning and then retreat without consequences, at least not in her mind. She stepped closer, too close. "You don't get to threaten the HOA," she said. "You don't get to intimidate volunteers who are simply enforcing community standards." I laughed, not loudly, just a brief breath of disbelief. "I'm not threatening anyone," I said. "I'm informing you. You're trespassing. You're blocking lawful access to private property. And if you don't move, I'll handle this the way property disputes actually get handled." Her eyes flicked sideways. "Is that a threat?" "No," I said. "That's a timeline." That's when the energy changed. Up until that moment, this had felt like a petty HOA stunt. Something theatrical that would dissolve once someone got bored. But timelines mean paperwork. Paperwork means lawyers. Lawyers mean exposure. And exposure is the one thing people who overreach absolutely despise. Linda scoffed again, but it didn't land the same way. You think you're special because you built something years ago. I don't think, I said. I know. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I didn't unlock it. Didn't show her a thing. I just held it loosely in my hand. I've got the deed, I said. The construction permits, maintenance records, tax filings, every boring document you didn't want to read but absolutely should have before you decided to play traffic cop. Someone behind her said, "Linda." She waved them off. "This is harassment." "No," I said, shaking my head. "This is what happens when you confuse confidence with authority." Silence again, heavier this time. Linda looked back at her group, and for the first time, she wasn't being followed. She was being watched. No nodding, no agreement, just quiet calculation. Because if she was wrong, and she dragged them into it, they weren't volunteers anymore. They were participants. That's when Linda made her biggest mistake. She pointed at the bridge. This bridge services a neighborhood. That makes it essential infrastructure. You can't deny access. That's abuse of control. I smiled, not smug, not cruel, just precise. "I'm not denying access," I said. "You are. I showed up to use my driveway. You blocked it." Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "You're twisting this," she snapped. "No," I said. "You twisted at the moment you decided you could regulate something you don't own." I took a step forward, not aggressive, intentional. "Last chance," I said. "Move the chairs." You could feel it then. The moment everyone realizes the situation has passed the point of recovery, that whatever happens next is going to stick in memory. Someone pulled out a phone. Someone else quietly picked up a cone and didn't know where to put it. Linda looked around. No support. No applause. No safety net. She exhaled sharply through her nose. "Fine," she said, "but this isn't over." Then she snapped her fingers at the others. "Clear it." Chairs scraped across the gravel. Cones were stacked clumsily, like no one quite knew where they belonged anymore. The sign came down last, lowered slowly, like a flag after a quiet surrender. I didn't say a word while they cleared it. I didn't need to. I walked back to my truck, climbed in, and rolled forward at an easy pace across the bridge. No revving. No dramatic acceleration. I crossed it the same way I always had. Because for me, nothing had changed. But behind me, everything had. I parked in my cabin driveway and shut off the engine. Sat there for a moment, just listening. No shouting. No confrontation. Just a sound of embarrassment settling behind me like fog. I stepped out, leaned against the truck, and looked back toward the bridge. Linda was still there, arms crossed, staring down the ground as if she might uncover a loophole hidden in the dirt. That should have been the end of it. But with people like her, it never is. The following week, the letters started arriving. Formal notices, requests for clarification, claims that I was leveraging infrastructure for personal gain. One letter accused me of creating a hostile access environment, which still makes me laugh. Linda, filed complaints with the HOA board. The county even floated the idea that I might be violating emergency access codes. So I responded the only way that actually works. Documentation. I sent copies of everything. The deed showing the bridge parcel in my name. The original engineering plans. Maintenance invoices. The easement map clearly outlining what access was granted, and more importantly, what wasn't. Every complaint died quietly after that. No hearings. No fines. No dramatic apology. Just silence. A few neighbors reached out privately. Emails. Short conversations at the mailbox. People who had lived under Linda's rulebook for years, afraid to push back because they didn't want to be that person. One guy told me, "I didn't think anyone could stop her." I said, "She stops herself. Someone just has to hold up the mirror." From that point on, Linda avoided my property like it was radioactive. If she was on her walking route and saw me near the bridge, she'd turn around. If she needed to inspect something nearby, suddenly it could wait. Not long after, I put up a sign. Nothing aggressive. Just a little humor. Private bridge. Unauthorized HOA enforcement prohibited. I never had another issue. Because the truth is, the conflict was never really about the bridge or the cabin or traffic rules. It was about someone who mistook borrowed authority for ownership and learned very publicly where that line actually is. That's where the real resolution lives. What stuck with me afterward wasn't the win. Wins like that are quiet. They don't feel like victories so much as corrections, like the universe nudging something back into alignment. What stayed with me was how close that situation came to going very differently. If I hadn't known where my rights began and hers ended, if I'd assumed the HOA's confidence meant legitimacy, if I'd done what most people do, sigh, turn around, and comply, because that's the system people like Linda rely on. The lesson here isn't that HOAs are evil or that every Karen deserves humiliation. That's too simple, and honestly, not very useful. The real lesson is about boundaries, legal boundaries, psychological boundaries, and the invisible line between cooperation and control. From a legal standpoint, authority is never implied. It's documented. HOAs don't operate on vibes, tradition, or we've always done it this way. They operate on governing documents, deeds, easements, and very specific grants of power. The moment you step outside those lines, enforcement turns into overreach. And overreach collapses the second someone asks for proof instead of permission. But there's a deeper layer, one most people miss. This is a psychological trap. People who volunteer for small governance roles often start with good intentions. But unchecked authority in a low-resistance environment does something subtle. It rewires how they see themselves. They stop thinking in terms of service and start thinking in terms of compliance. Rules stop being tools and start becoming weapons. Disagreement starts to feel like rebellion. Linda didn't block the bridge because of safety. She blocked it because she wanted to be obeyed. That distinction matters. Once you understand it, your response changes. You stop arguing emotionally. You stop trying to convince. You stop explaining yourself to someone who isn't listening. Instead, you anchor yourself in facts, documentation, and calm certainty. According to standard procedure, the most effective response to overreach isn't escalation. It's clarity. Clear ownership, clear language, clear consequences, no insults, no shouting, no drama, just reality, presented plainly. That's uncomfortable for people who rely on intimidation, because intimidation only works when the other person feels unsure. There's also something to be said about restraint. I could have gone nuclear, threatened lawsuits, called enforcement, turned it into a spectacle, but I didn't, and that choice mattered. Quiet wins have a longer half-life. They don't provoke retaliation. They don't give the other side a victim narrative. They simply end the behavior. That's why the aftermath was silence. Not because Linda suddenly became self-aware, but because she ran out of ground to stand on. If you're dealing with an HOA or any authority figure and something feels off, here's the practical takeaway. Ask where their authority comes from. Ask to see it in writing. Ask which document grants them the power they're claiming. Not aggressively, not sarcastically, just neutrally. You'd be surprised how often the confidence evaporates. And for those of you serving on HOA boards or volunteer committees, this applies to you too. Authority isn't something you feel. It's something you steward. The moment enforcement becomes about ego instead of function, you've already crossed a line, whether anyone calls you out or not. At the end of the day, this wasn't about winning an argument with Linda. It was about something simpler and bigger. Property rights exist, so power has limits. Rules exist, so order doesn't depend on personalities. Respect only survives where boundaries are clear. So I'm curious, have you ever dealt with an HOA that overstepped? Have you ever complied just to avoid conflict and regretted it later? Or maybe you've been on the other side, watching someone let authority go to their head? Drop your story in the comments. I read them. Because the more we talk about where power ends, the harder it becomes for anyone to pretend it doesn't. And trust me, some bridges are worth defending.